All right, let's talk about what might just be the most insane corporate takeover in the history of the world. Seriously. We're talking about how a single, for-profit company, a business, managed to conquer an entire subcontinent. It's a wild story, so let's get right into it.
So, to really get a sense of just how big this story is, let's start with a number. $45 trillion. That's the best estimate we have for the amount of wealth that was siphoned out of India during almost 200 years of British rule. I mean, it's an almost unimaginable amount of money, right? And it really sets the stage for this incredible story of corporate ambition and conquest on a scale that's, well, it's never been seen before or since.
So, the big question is, how on earth did this happen? I mean, think about it. We're talking about India, a place that historical giants, even Alexander the Great, couldn't conquer. And yet, a private company started by just 25 traders in a London coffee shop somehow pulled it off. How did a business succeed where massive empires have failed? That is the puzzle we're going to piece together today.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. The first thing you have to understand is that this wasn't some quick, overnight invasion by a foreign army. Not at all. This was a slow burn. It was a calculated corporate strategy that played out over 2 centuries. You could almost call it a grand heist, pulled off piece by painstaking piece. All right, so let's paint a picture of India back in the 16th and 17th centuries. You have to imagine it as the absolute center of global trade. I mean, it was the place to be. Everybody wanted a piece of the action. You had the Portuguese show up first, then the Dutch came in and totally dominated the super profitable spice trade. And then on August 24th, 1608, a ship from the British East India Company finally lands. And they weren't the last either. The French showed up a little later. So India was this crowded, competitive marketplace with all these European powers elbowing each other for an advantage. And you know, at first, the East India Company, let's just call them the EIC, they were definitely not the top dog. Not even close. They were just another player trying to get a foothold. In fact, their first big attempt to get into the spice trade in Indonesia was a complete disaster. The Dutch and Spanish basically ran them out of town. So with their options running out, they turned their full attention to India. It was almost their last resort. And this is where everything changes. The company has a realization. To really make the kind of money they wanted, they couldn't just be merchants. They needed more power. They had to become a political and a military force. Their whole business model was about the shift from trading spices to wielding swords.
So you can actually see this transformation happen step by step. In 1609, they get completely shut down. The Mughal emperor basically tells them to get lost. But then, just a few years later, in 1612, their small navy pulls off a shocking victory against a much bigger Portuguese fleet. And that gets the emperor's attention. Suddenly, these guys aren't just traders, they have some real military muscle. By 1615, a clever diplomat named Sir Thomas Roe uses that new respect to finally nail down a trade deal. But the real game changer? That comes in 1670, when the King of England himself gives the EIC the right to buy land, print its own money, and, get this, raise its own private army. I mean, look at this contrast. It says everything. In 1615, they're on their knees, respectfully asking for permission to do business. Fast forward to 1686, and they're so full of confidence that they literally declare war on the entire Mughal Empire. Now, full disclosure, they got absolutely crushed in that war. It was a total humiliation, but it shows you just how much their mindset had changed. They were thinking like a state now, not just a company. And crucially, they learned from that defeat and decided to wait for the perfect moment. And that perfect moment, it arrived in 1707. The powerful Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb died, and his empire started to crumble. It created this massive power vacuum, and the EIC, which was now this lean, mean, battle-tested corporation, was sitting right there, ready to jump in. And their first big target was Bengal, which just happened to be the single richest province in all of India. And it's here, in Bengal, that the EIC really perfects its signature move for takeovers. We can call it the Plassey playbook. It was brilliant, and it was ruthless. See, they realized they didn't need a giant army of their own. They just needed to be smart. First, they'd provoke the local ruler, get on his bad side. Then, they'd secretly go behind his back and find a traitor, in this case, his own army commander, Mir Jafar, and promise him the throne. They even got the richest banker in the region to finance the whole scheme. So what happened? At the so-called Battle of Plassey, Mir Jafar's army, which was the vast majority of the troops, just stood there. They didn't fight. The EIC's tiny force of 3,000 soldiers walked all over an army of 50,000. It wasn't really a battle at all. It was
a hostile takeover, executed with military precision. And if anyone thought Plassey was just a lucky break, the Battle of Buxar a few years later proved them wrong. This time, there was no conspiracy, no betrayal. This was a straight-up fight. The EIC's army defeated the combined forces of 3 major Indian powers, including the Mughal emperor himself. This victory was so total, so undeniable, that it forced the emperor to the negotiating table. And what came out of that negotiation was this document, the Treaty of Allahabad. And it contained one little word that changed everything: Diwani. The Diwani gave the East India Company the right to collect taxes from all 20 million people living in Bengal. This is the exact moment a private company stops being just a company and becomes a government. Think about it. Their main source of revenue wasn't trade anymore, it was taxes. And all that tax money, that's what they were going to use to fund the conquest of the rest of India. So, with the enormous wealth of Bengal now filling their war chest and funding their private army, the company turned its attention to the last major power standing in their way, the powerful and sprawling Maratha Empire. And guess what they did? They pulled out the same old Plassey playbook and just adapted it. See, the Maratha Empire wasn't really one solid kingdom, it was more like a loose confederation of chiefs who were constantly fighting with each other for power. That infighting was the perfect crack for the EIC to exploit. They'd find an ambitious Maratha leader, someone like Raghunath Rao, and offer him the company's army to help him win his own internal power struggles. And in return for that help, they'd demand a little bit of land, some money, a bit of political control. And by the time the Maratha chiefs finally realized what was happening, that the company was taking over from the inside, it was already too late. They were too powerful to kick out. Okay, so with most of their military rivals now out of the picture, the EIC's conquest shifts gears. It enters this new, kind of more sinister phase. I mean, war is expensive, right? But paperwork is cheap. And that's exactly what the doctrine of lapse was. It was corporate policy turned into a weapon of conquest. The rule was deceptively simple. If an Indian ruler died without a direct male heir, his kingdom was declared lapsed and it was automatically absorbed by the company. No battle, no treaty, no negotiation. Just a signature on a document. And this simple administrative rule is how huge states like Satara, Nagpur, and the famous kingdom of Jhansi were just eaten up by the company. It was the final and chillingly efficient stage of their takeover. So, after 100 years of this, a century of corporate exploitation, of crushing taxes, of land being snatched away through political tricks, the people of India had simply had enough. They'd reached their breaking point. The company's relentless, single-minded pursuit of profit had planted the seeds of a massive, violent rebellion. And the spark that finally lit the fuse came in 1857. A rumor started spreading like wildfire through the company's own army of Indian soldiers, the Sepoys. The rumor was that the new rifle cartridges they were being issued were greased with cow and pig fat, which is deeply offensive to both Hindus and Muslims. One soldier, Mangal Pandey, famously refused to use them and revolted. And that one act of defiance was all it took. The mutiny exploded into a huge, nationwide uprising. Rulers who lost their kingdoms, like Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, joined the fight, and it turned into a full-blown war against the EIC. In the end, the revolt was crushed, and it was incredibly brutal. But the sheer scale of the rebellion sent shockwaves all the way back to London. It was a massive wake-up call for the British government. They finally realized that letting a for-profit corporation run an entire subcontinent with its own army was a recipe for disaster. The company had become too powerful, too reckless, and it was now a liability. And that brings us to the end of the line for the company. In 1858, the British government did something pretty drastic. They essentially nationalized their own rogue corporation. The East India Company was officially dissolved. Everything, all its land, its huge private army, all its assets, was transferred directly to the British Crown. The age of corporate rule in India was over, and the age of the British Raj, direct imperial rule, had officially begun. So, when you look back, the story of the East India Company is it's a stunning example of what can happen when corporate power is completely unchecked, when it's armed with the ability to wage war and govern people. It started as a simple business venture, a hunt for profit, and it ended with the complete takeover of a nation. And that leaves us with a pretty heavy question for our own time, doesn't it? In a world of global megacorporations that have budgets bigger than many countries, what does the story from history teach us about that very fine and maybe very blurry line between corporate influence and state power today?